Okay, so I'm back and I'm reading the next section of From Martin Van Buren to Joe Biden, Debunking the Magical Switching Party's Conspiracy Theory. So this is chapters 1 and 2. I crammed a lot of stuff in there already with the introduction, so that's the introduction. The first proper chapter here is about continuity of personnel. The politicians didn't switch. Because if the parties switched, we should expect to see a number of things. We should expect to see politicians switch parties. We should expect to see voters switch parties. We should expect to see platform switch parties. And, like most every dispute, you can invent some test questions and see whether the theory holds water. So those are mine. Anyway, the only two guys in Congress switched parties. Strom Thurmond in the Senate, Albert Watson in the House. If the parties had switched, there would have been a veritable stampede of party switchers. Now, Albert Watson washed out of politics following a particularly ugly and even racist campaign for South Carolina's governorship in 1970. He lost pretty spectacularly, a very winnable contest, and this scared Thurmond straight. After 1970, Thurmond really tones it down. Whether you think he reformed privately, I leave that to you, but his public statements were not what they were in, say, 1964. The overemphasis of Thurmond aside, the narrativers can't point to any surge of defections. This doesn't stop them from trying. For instance, Kevin M. Cruz, and the M stands for mountebank. He likes doing these interminable Twitter threads containing nonstop nonsense. In between supposedly being a Princeton professor, I don't know how he has time for that with all these interminable Twitter threads. Anyway, for example, his May 5, 2018 thread, he recounts William Buckley's speculation of which Southerners might follow Thurmond, as though this proved the Republican Party itself had any such plans. And because he's a mountebank, the newspapers he posts screenshots of as proof frequently undercut his story. For example, one article from 1969 posted in his May 15, 2018 thread titled the newspaper article, "Would They Rather Switch Than Fight?" by Theo Lipman Jr. says, quote, "Rumored plan to entice a few senators, now Democrats, to join the Republicans." It concludes, quote, "The whole idea may be a little paranoid. Whether it arose in a persecuted liberal mind or a deluded conservative mind, or in both, is a good question. The stories that best indicate the political mood of Republicans in the South these days concern not switching but winning," end quote. So Cruz thinks that's evidence supporting him because he's a mountebank. Also, excuse me. Also note that the article's title is "Would They Rather Switch Than Fight?" not "They Would Rather Switch Than Fight." So it's speculation on a rumor, much like the anonymous sources and their bombshells, which all prove to be duds. Then, almost no one who voted against the civil rights bills then switches parties, so the count is inflated by counting people who weren't in Congress in 1964, like Jesse Helms, not in the Senate till 72, Trent Lott, not in Congress till 72, and John Tower, already in the Senate since 1964, never switches parties. Also, the areas Helms or Tower won, looking at county maps, are the same places that Ike won. So there's that. Let me see what else here. Also, so they win where Eisenhower won, so they're building on Ike's voters, not a supposed stampede of switching segregationist supporters. Now, going down to the state level, really changes nothing. Kevin Mountebank Cruz thinks he's dunking on Dinesh when he digs up stuff from the state level and dredges up a few dozen more Democrat segregationists who became Republicans. So a few dozen such Democrats at the state level out of how many? Across the 11 former Confederate states, there's 1,325 total state House seats and 457 state Senate seats, totaling 1,782 state legislative seats. Now, for simplicity's sake, we're just going to take each state's governor, attorney general, and secretary of state. For simplicity's sake, ignoring other offices, and this adds 33 more public officials. Tallied up, we get 1,815 officials, which is going to be Cruz's Waterloo, because a few dozen out of 1,815 officials is next to nobody. So contextless Kevin Cruz falls flat on his face again. Cruz also insists that people and voters changing parties is not how realignments work. But that is how realignments work. Whig remnants sorted themselves into Democrats and Republicans as slavery became the dominant issue. Politicians moved. In 1928 and 1932, voters realigned and replaced the offending politicians without making new parties. New Deal coalition formed. In any case, realignments don't happen 30 years after or 10 years before their purported cause. We also get into irrelevant detours into the 60s southern state-level antics of people like Bo Calloway of Georgia, Rubel Phillips, or Jill Carmichael in Mississippi. Did some of them campaign as segregationist light against bona fide segregationist Democrats? Yeah, but they didn't flip the South. The South was flipped in the 1990s at the state level, and that was from a Southern surge in the late 80s and early 90s. These guys that Cruz and company tout so obnoxiously are footnotes being presented as headlines. Contemporary columnists Arthur Kroc and Joseph Alsop hyped these 1960s Southern GOP candidates in their own time as the start of a transformation of the GOP, and many modern Democrats echo this. Yet applying this logic to non-civil rights subject illustrates the absurdity of this. Larry Hogan of Maryland, Charlie Baker of Massachusetts, Phil Scott of Vermont, three Republican governors with liberal stances on abortion and guns. Yet nobody suggests that this indicates the parties will imminently reverse themselves on abortion and guns. These governors compete in Democrat-created spaces of social liberalism. Ditto Joe Manchin, Democrat senator of West Virginia, and his support of the coal industry. Yet nobody confuses his position with that of his party. Yet, for narrative-driven reasons, the same is not granted in the case of particular Southern Republicans running segregation-light campaigns in a Democrat-created environment. Yet that era's voters were not fooled, and racists went for the real thing, the Democrats, which kept the South Democrat. Democrat majorities depended on the South, hence why none were expelled or denounced by leadership. This matters because it takes the consent of the group they claim membership in for them to be members. Contrast this with assertions that David Duke, the Klan, or the alt-right define the GOP. The media, outsiders, declaring it so does not make it so, when the group, the GOP, does not consent. For example, if I said that I was the quarterback of the New York Jets, which in many recent years may have even been an improvement, but nevertheless, if the Jets denied it and CNN declares me to be the Jets quarterback, does CNN declaring it so make it so? Of course not. Now apply that to David Duke and the GOP. He's not with us. In contrast, Democrats, while they repudiate the segregationists now, they embrace them when it mattered. In fact, Democrats directed blacks to vote for them, providing the margins to elect George Wallace, John Stennis, James Eastland, Fritz Hollings, and so forth into the 70s and 80s. The reason Democrats embraced them when it mattered is most segregationists provided reliable votes on non-civil rights issues. We'll get to that more in the chapter on platforms. As Hubert Humphrey's legislative assistant John G. Stewart recounted, Senator Joe Clark of Pennsylvania took a very hard-nosed and somewhat acrimonious position that the Southerners should be more or less punished for their sins and should be given no consideration whatsoever in this position of cloture on the 64 Civil Rights Bill. Mansfield, and to a lesser extent Humphrey, urged a much softer line. They pointed out that party unity was essential, that other bills would be coming along, and that we should attempt to be charitable at this time, end quote. That's from Joseph D. Loewy's book, The Civil Rights Act of 64. Where is it? I think it's page 132, but don't quote me on that. It's in my notes somewhere here. But yeah. Some spin them as conservative Southern Democrats who formed a conservative coalition with Republicans. If true, what great conservative legislation did they pass that would do the Tea Party proud? The Taft-Hartley bill is about it, and government spending grew throughout. Others say they stayed because of seniority rules, yet the 1974 Watergate babies altered said rules, stripping William Poedge, Wright Patman, Wilbur Mills, and Edward Hebert of committee chairmanship more or less on the spot. Yet the massive Southern Democrats stayed Democrat over the platform. Bonus section. The Klan didn't switch. All Klan members and leaders of the era either one stayed Democrat, or two tried to insert themselves into existing fringe parties, or three tried creating their own fringe third parties. Only David Duke, a more recently arrived actor, ever tried to call himself a Republican. Duke, who dabbled in 5 different parties, was in the Klan from 1974 to 1980, at which time he was a Democrat. Duke was never in the Klan, coterminous with being a self-declared and unwanted Republican. Not only can I not find other Klan Republicans, the press would write articles unceasing if any stampede had occurred. The silence itself is a bombshell. As for the alt-right, yes, I do get to that, but that's near the end of the last chapter. So that's the end of the first chapter, which is the shortest one about the personnel not switching. I mean, you can only write so many words about how only 2 guys in Congress changed parties. So it was the shortest section. The second of 3 chapters is called Continuity of Voting Patterns. The voters didn't switch. So as I said way back in the introduction, the very long intro, this idea of Goldwater is a pivotal central figure, and of 1964 as the critical decisive election only emerges in the mid-1970s, hitting its stride, if not outright invented by, the book The Transformation of Southern Politics from 1976 by Jack Bass and Walter DeVries. It was the most anomalous election in American history and was recognized as such at the time. Nevertheless, the narratives claim that Goldwater's racist dog whistle campaign, with limited government as a proxy for hating blacks, caused Southern Republican breakthroughs. Richard Nixon imitated this in 1968 with craftier appeals and greater success. These appeals part of a Southern strategy to bring racists upset with the Democrats' moral transformation on civil rights, the story goes. Nixon reprised his coded appeals about busing, law and order, and the silent majority in 1972, turning Wallace's voters into Republicans, implying they were his in 1968 but for Wallace. Racism's drop in respectability made future Republicans subtler still, like Reagan's welfare queen remarks or his opposition to affirmative action, with obsessive anti-communism as coded racism, with obsessive anti-communism as coded opposition to equality itself, because communism's watchword is equality, and doesn't he know capitalism is racist? The magical switching party's conspiracy theory says all this moved Southern whites on the basis of sublimated racial animosity via proxy issues to support the small government party. This narrative functions by overemphasizing 1964, mischaracterizing 1968, and ignoring other elections. The historical base of the Republican Party was the Yankee rural Northeast, with the southern Black Belt rural areas the historical base areas of the Democrats. Elections generally follow a continuum, the winner taking its base areas most strongly, taking swing areas, and in landslide years, flipping areas that lean towards the other party in typical years. No other base state swaps exist in U.S. history, not previous Democrat or Republican contests, nor subsequent ones, nor Whig versus Democrat contests, nor even Federalist versus Democratic Republican contests. Go check out the maps and see for yourself. Those hyping historical footnote Goldwater and creating the Goldwater centrality myth of Southern politics are actually Eisenhower deniers. These Eisenhower deniers ignore the 1952 election where he won Virginia, Florida, Tennessee, and Texas and got 48% of all Southern votes. Ike repeated this in 1956, adding Louisiana, attaining 49.8% plurality of Southern votes. He nearly won South Carolina in 1952, nearly took North Carolina both times, and Ike ran ahead of all previous GOP candidates in all Southern states. Nixon in 1960 took Virginia, Florida, and Tennessee, and though fraud halted him in Texas, Tricky Dick amassed 46.1% of Southern votes, despite Southerner LBJ's presence on JFK's ticket. After Little Rock, despite supporting civil rights bills and attacking JFK's civil rights record. Such gains follow previous steady gains the GOP made since 1936. By 1940, the GOP won 25% of Southern presidential votes, long before Democrats even pretended to care about civil rights. Other factors, unaddressed by narrative pushers, but addressed later in this chapter, explain it all. Goldwater's 1964 mark of 49.0% of all Southern votes fell from Ike's 1956 mark of 49.8%, a step backwards, not a watershed. In Congress, the 1950s GOP gained a few urban districts in Texas, Florida, North Carolina, and Virginia, in Ike's best areas, which inspired Operation Dixie. In 1960, the GOP House candidates got 21% of the South's votes, 33% of the South's votes in 1962, but went backwards to 32% in 1964, and then up to 34% of all Southern votes for Congress in 1966. So the 1964 breakthrough went backwards. Even gerrymandering can't explain that away. But the unavoidable fact is Republicans were gaining in the South before Goldwater while pushing a pro-civil rights agenda, obliterating the narrative. Operation Dixie preceded Goldwater, inspired by Ike's success in his congressional coattails in urban outer South areas. The GOP saw these gains as proof the South was becoming less sectional, so I. Lee Potter tried recruiting ambitious Southern men to run as Republicans for local offices, lower-level offices. One Jamie Boulle, B-O-U-L-L-E. However you pronounce it, he is refuted by Sean Trend. When Jamie tried to assert a 1960s jump in GOP Southern congressional vote share meant racism swayed votes towards the GOP. What he omits is, that's when they started running candidates. Oh my God, you mean you run more candidates, you'll get more votes? No shit, Sherlock. Pre-Operation Dixie, many Southern offices lacked challengers. Returning to 1964, Goldwater's defeat is no mystery. The press maligned him, which he magnified by giving them a lot of material, to be fair. But the magical switching party's conspiracy theory pushers will always say, but why the election map? Well, because when the only news sources smear a guy as racist, the racists will vote for him and the rest against him. Hitting the jackpot on their first try hooked the Democrats on race hustling, which grew over time as upward mobility dampened their class warfare Huey Long rhetoric, and that effect on working class whites. So, now in Southern terms, 1972 dwarfs 1964 in importance, as the GOP in 1972 swept the Deep South without losing everything else, a feat only possible because race wasn't the issue it was in 64 or even 68. The only significance of the 1964 election is that it began the trend of Democrats smearing everyone in their way as racist and Nazis. Race hustling defines modern Democrats. Just look at everything they've called racist in the past 10 years alone. And it's all a smokescreen. It's not just who started winning in the South, Eisenhower, or when they started doing it, 1952, as culmination of a trend that began in 36, but also where within the South they started winning and with which Southerners they started winning. There is the Outer South, there's the Deep South. On a whole state basis, the Outer South is Texas, Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, and Florida. The Deep South is Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. On a political cultural basis, many southern states are part Outer South and part Deep South, to sort of give a shorthand of what's Deep South. Basically take maybe the eastern 100 miles or so of Texas, southeastern corner of Oklahoma, maybe the southeastern, slice Arkansas diagonally into like two triangles, the southeastern one of Arkansas, West Tennessee around Memphis, like all of Mississippi, southern 2/3 or so of Alabama, the southern 3/4 or so of Georgia, maybe the northern third of Florida, practically all of South Carolina, maybe the eastern third or half of North Carolina, and then the sort of eastern Virginia, particularly the southeastern quarter or so. So this is where you get all the the planter class, the biggest support for segregation and so forth. So this Deep South cultural area, as I'll call it, the Black Belts basically. Actually, for an even more concise description, just look at the counties won by Al Smith in 28, or Thurmond in 48, or Barry Goldwater in 64, or George Wallace in 68. Smith's case proves instructive because in 1928, it pitted anti-Catholicism against anti-blackness. The Democrats accused Hoover of plotting segregation's demise, and Republicans, for their part, put out some interesting theories about Al Smith's intentions, something to the effect of the Pope was going to come here and actually run everything in a secret fortress. And Al Smith was in on all that. So anyway, the results of pitting the anti-Catholicism against the anti-blackness. Hoover won 187 of 266 counties that were under 5% black, and Smith won 184 of 191 counties that were over 50% black, and amassed a record turnout therein. So this Deep South cultural area of Black Belt counties had the most plantations, strongest support for slavery and secession, the most lynchings, the most fervent defense of segregation, the strongest Democrat support, all built by racism and class warfare rhetoric. In the second Republican conquest of Dixie, the first being the Civil War, the GOP captured the Outer South faster. Insofar as they won in the Deep South, it was in urban areas, not rural. Supposed appeals to bigotry can't explain an urban-rural differential. The Outer South and the cities and suburbs fell first to the GOP, and which garnered most of their votes from there for all levels of government, presidency on down. 1964 is the anomaly. Looking at the general pattern of GOP success, it looks like the Eisenhower County vote pattern spreading outwards. Notably, it's true of the 1966 midterms, right after 64, when everything supposedly flip-flopped, which Democrat hacks like calling the 66 results, they like calling it white backlash to civil rights. But look where the GOP won. The 1966 House map resembles the 1960 and 1962 maps, not the 64 one, with Deep South losses and Outer South gains, mostly urban or bordering existing GOP-held districts. A party-riding backlash would be adding Deep South seats while losing northern ones, yet most 1966 Republican gains occurred outside the South altogether, and roughly half of the overall gains were simply the same non-Southern districts lost in 1964. Backlash balderdash conflates Great Society welfare programs with civil rights, yet segregationists voted for the first idea and opposed the second, while Republicans favored the second idea but rejected the first one. Non-racial issues drove 1966, from declining farm prices and farmer incomes. Many Farm Belt seats flipped, including a whole bunch in Iowa. I think like 5 or 6 seats gained back were just Iowa ones. To Democrats pushing welfarism at home and war abroad. Well, 1964's landslide gains for Democrats increased 1966's midterm targets. The voting data denies the magical switching party's conspiracy theory and debunks lies about 1968 as well. Looking at state-by-state data, it belies claims of a Southern strategy, at least as described by liberals. The deeper south you go, the more Nixon's numbers worsen. His Northeast state percentages typically beat his Southern ones, Rhode Island and Massachusetts accepted. In no former Confederate state did Nixon top 45%, and only in Virginia and Florida did he top 40%. Oklahoma, where he got 47%, wasn't a state during the Civil War. The supposed Southern strategy hinges on the unproven idea that Nixon voters were would-be Wallace voters, but Nixon majorities arose from traditional GOP mountain strength combined with Outer South urban and suburban middle-class white-collar voters. He carried the Outer South because such states had more cities and thus more suburbs. Nixon won counties with few blacks, winning whites in whiter areas based on economics, whereas Wallace won with negrophobic rural whites from counties with high black populations. Nor was Wallace a conservative, as his 1968 platform and class warfare rhetoric shows. He didn't compete for Nixon's base. Observe also the red county continuity. Nixon's 1968 county-level vote patterns are practically identical to that of 1960, and nearly so to Eisenhower's 1952 and 1956 outings. How could Nixon's supposedly new strategy produce a 1968 vote pattern that resembles Eisenhower's 1952 showing? How could he win and lose the same folks that he did in 1960? Because he had no such supposed Southern strategy. If it's nowhere to be found in the voting data, that means it didn't happen. By the time we get to Reagan, he won Southern states quite narrowly, but again, his Plains results were better. His Plains were the strongest for Nixon, too. While taking Florida, Texas, and Virginia commandingly, Reagan struggled regionally, winning Alabama by 1.3 points, Arkansas by 0.61 points, won Louisiana by 5.45 points, Mississippi by 1.32 points, and North Carolina by 2.12 points, South Carolina by 1.53 points, and Tennessee by 0.29 points. Reagan's largest margins, like Nixon's, came in plains and mountain states, where he won 66% of the vote in Ohio, 57% in Kansas, 56% in Montana, 65% in Nebraska, 64% in North Dakota, 60% in Oklahoma, 60% in South Dakota, 72% in Utah, and 62% in Wyoming. The location of Reagan's most intense support reveals his appeal, which was not coded racism, but middle American common sense, pride in this country, and a desire to see her succeed against the very Soviet Union that killed more people than Hitler in between invading everyone who looked at them funny. But even state percentages don't capture the whole story because counties reveal what states conceal. True, some counties with big cities tip entire states, and knowing this helps win elections, but county-level analysis shows which party benefits electorally from which cultural patterns. Examine county maps for 1952, 1956, 1960, 1968, 1976, and 1980. Ignore Wallace, ignore unpledged electors, compare Republicans to Republicans. It's roughly the same map all 6 times. Behold the red county continuity. Inside the South, Republicans won mountains and suburbs, especially those of South and Central Florida, adding the plains of the Texas Panhandle and Hill Country of West Central Texas. GOP support in Arkansas expands southeast from the Ozarks, while Democrats dominated the black belts that built the Confederacy and Jim Crow. Had the parties switched, the voters would too. They didn't. Nixon wins where Eisenhower wins, and loses where Eisenhower loses. Gerald Ford's support areas matched Nixon's and Ike's, both in location and demographics, and Ford's percentages with Southern whites, about 56 to 42%, mirror Ike's. Ronald Reagan encroaches into longtime Democrat areas, though by 1980s, race isn't the issue, and the GOP progressed outward from cities, not outward from the black belts. Their expansion followed Eisenhower's pattern, not Goldwater's. Reagan did best with younger, more educated white Southerners, while older white Southerners, the age range more in favor of segregation, started dying off without ever becoming Republicans. In fact, most of George Wallace's voters chose Carter in 1976 and 1980. National landslides like 1972 prove uninstructive, and the 1964 anomaly deserves no further attention. hence the focus on 52, 56, 60, 68, 76, and 80. The old pattern of a voting pattern largely goes back to the Civil War era, except for some of the newer suburban stuff that backed Ike. Extinct presidentially by 84 in the South, persisted in the 1990s at the lower levels, the GOP's base areas mirroring the 1952 to 1980 presidential situation. This slowly, after the 1984 election, morphs into the modern pattern, which amounts to cities versus all comers, intensifying 2000 to present. Bill Clinton still held on to middle America and lots of rural and exurban whites. He was the last gasp of America before identity politics totally consumed the Democratic Party. The Democrats, built on urban machines plus the South, lost the South and doubled down on machines. Bleeding white voters who now reject class warfare rhetoric, Democrats pivoted to race warfare rhetoric, grounded in fake history, to spike minority turnout. Democrats then cite minority voters as social proof of their civil rights bona fides. And yet, no minority group became Democrat over civil rights, or even during the civil rights era. Blacks and Hispanics became Democrats in the 1930s. Asians became Democrats in the 1990s. No group changed their votes because of civil rights. But returning to the matter of why the outer South white Southerners of urban areas and suburban areas took the South for the GOP, there is indeed another factor I haven't mentioned yet that explains it even better than age or urban versus rural or college educated or not. Income. The pre-40 South had a one-crop plantation economy and was a third-world country within a first-world country in both incomes and human rights. As the New Deal made northern industrial states too expensive and too unionized for some employers to tolerate, many set up shop in the non-union low-wage South, which had the effect of saving employers money as compared to the North, yet these were higher wages than most Southerners were accustomed to seeing. White-collar growth in entrepreneurs and professionals, and all the rest rose up on top of this industrializing, modernizing base as its superstructure, as it were, or at least I think superstructure is the right term. I could be botching my Marxist lingo, but yeah, basically the professionals and the specialists don't appear till the other modern industry does. And in any case, these richer professionals in the suburbs combined with the poor but historically Republican Appalachian people to create a Republican majority in many outer South states. A majority that only grew as more whites became rich enough to start voting Republican. As to the trajectory and chosen path of black voters, I'll get to that in a second, but the richest whites were the most Republican and earliest. As detailed in Byron Schaefer and Richard Johnston's 2006 book, The End of Southern Exceptionalism, they divided them into terciles. It's sort of like those, the top 20%, bottom 20%, the quintiles. Okay, it's like quintiles but thirds. Cutting the population into thirds, the richest tercile of whites rose from 53% GOP support in the Eisenhower years to 77% in the Reagan years, a 24% rise. The poorest tercile went from 43% to 51% GOP support over the same period, an 8% rise. The gap between the two grew from 10% to 26%. In order to believe race drove this, one must think that money makes a man 26% more racist, and somehow explain why republicanism of the middle income group falls between that of the poorest and that of the richest. It's almost like this is all driven by income rather than race. Plus, most poor Republicans in that 1950s 43% were traditional Appalachian Mountain Republicans. I mean, technically Southern, but not the racist Democrat base. Few of whom ever converted because richer whites led the way top on down to flip the South for the GOP. This is the class-based Southern voter shift. This class-based Southern voter shift drives the red county continuity. There's some other points where I would dispute Schaefer and Johnston, however. For example, take the way black belt whites voted presidentially more Republican, in a way unmirrored at other levels of government, and this perplexes the authors, who think maybe they're voting their racial preferences nationally and economic preferences locally. I think a better explanation is that something peculiar to the presidency is a more compelling explanation, and therefore I say that I think they were really just voting their foreign policy preferences. The South likes a good fight. We'll put it that way. They like a good fight to the point where they started one in the 1860s. Anyway, because Reagan would actually fight back against the Ruskies. Now, the most enraging part about all this is that little of the above was unknowable or unknown at the time in the 60s and 70s. And many people saw these exact same things as they happened. Donald Strong, noted rising urban Southern Republicanism was taking place as early as 1940, most of all among higher income voters, which started the accelerating trend I just mentioned. This is from Donald Strong in his 1953 book called The 1952 Presidential Election in the South. Barry Goldwater notes in his 1970 book, Conscience of a Majority, that 1994 and 1948 saw Thomas Dewey polling one-third of the total popular vote in the area embraced by Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Virginia. The gains concentrated in urban areas. So Nelson Polsby and Dinesh D'Souza and Sean Trend and Byron Schaefer and Richard Johnston, what they really did was they unearthed what the Democrats had willfully buried for several decades. What liberals omitted from textbooks will be shouted from the rooftops. When we know what really happened, and when we know that this was common knowledge at that time, it becomes clear why all this race baiting didn't stop the 1972 and 1984 landslides, whereas modern elections get more dicey. Many people who knew better have since died, replaced by millennials who were not wise to the Democrats' con on the subject. Even with regard to Nixon and Wallace voters, I got Richard Scammon and Ben J. Wattenberg in The Real Majority, an extraordinary examination of the American electorate. This is 1970. He proved at length that Wallace voters and Nixon voters were not the same group of people. This was confirmed by other authors who declared, quote, Republicans and Wallaceites are different types of people. They belong to different types of clubs and churches, go different places on Saturday night and Sunday morning, and respond differently to bigness, end quote. James Clotfeller, William R. Hamilton, Beyond Race Politics, Electing Southern Populists in the 1970s, and You Can't Eat Magnolias, edited H. Brandt Ayers, Thomas H. Naylor, 1972, page 155. So in other words, all this was known about at the time and lied about for decades since. And no wonder, because Wallace's appeals qualitatively differed from Nixon. Dan Carter tried to rescue the narrative. He hyped polls where 80% of Southern Wallace backers named Nixon as their second choice, which is all overblown woulda, coulda, shoulda. Nixon had a shot, Wallace didn't, everyone knew it, and shifting last month polls and final votes reflect this fact. Polls taken a month before Election Day showed Nixon at 43%, Humphrey at 29%, and Wallace at 22%. Polls just before Election Day had Nixon and Humphrey tied at 42%, with Wallace at 13%. So Wallace's support had been drained and went to Humphrey, not Nixon. Polls in the summer of 1968 showed nearly half of Union members favored Wallace. Humphrey regained them with claims Nixon would dismantle various pro-labor and big government things they liked. Yet if a pro-government voting bloc considered Wallace, this damages the notion that Nixon and Wallace offered something similar, or that such folks would ever vote for Nixon unless the alternative was somebody way out in left field like McGovern. Analysis of subsequent elections shows Jimmy Carter got the Wallace vote in 1976. And as Schaefer and Johnston show, he largely held it in 1980 as well. Narrative pushers will tell you that Nixon won the whole South in 1972. True, but meaningless. Nixon won every state not named Massachusetts. He won 62% of the vote in Hawaii, which I suppose the Southern Strategy did, or something. Nixon won every county in 20 states, all but one county in 6 more, and all but 2 counties in another 10 states, holding McGovern to 130 counties nationally. There is no way around it. Supposed Southern strategies don't produce national landslides, and had Nixon done any such thing, he would have lost the rest of America. It'd be 64 all over again. Nor do such notions explain why Nixon won 18% of the black vote in 1972, up from 9% in 1968. How can appeals to racism cause black vote share to double? That makes no sense. Even if one asserts the counterfactual that Nixon won with Wallace's old voters and backs us up by mentioning Nixon's 1972 percentages approximate the combined 68 Nixon and 68 Wallace percentages, actual vote counts will collapse this narrative. Vote counts show rather than this, the real story is that blacks stayed home. 1972 turnout fell from 68. Turnout down, Democrat vote totals down more. Humphrey's 3-way share of the vote surpassed McGovern's 2-way vote share. Virtually all of Humphrey's Deep South votes came from blacks. Thus, McGovern's smaller Deep South totals demonstrate black enthusiasm fell. Let's see. The final attempt to rescue the narrative with distorting voting data is this notion of bridge candidates. Dan T. Carter asserts Wallace was one, and Kerry Frederickson asserts Thurman's 1948 campaign provided another. Except if we look where Eisenhower won in 52 in the South, very little of it overlaps with Thurman's winning areas. It's overwhelmingly the 1948 Truman areas of the South. And looking at where Nixon won in 1972, he wins everything but Massachusetts, so that's uninstructive. And most of the Wallace 68 areas go to Carter in 76 and even 1980. Meanwhile, Gerald Ford and Ronald Reagan areas are mostly the old Nixon 68 and 60 areas, a.k.a. the old Eisenhower and areas from 52 and 56, mountains and suburbs. Eventually, the party switch conspiracy theorists realized they had to smear the suburbs. So Kevin Cruz does this in his 2005 Quackwork White Flight. In it, Kevin Cruz claims whites not only fled Atlanta out of anti-black animus, but the pro-segregation arguments they made typified what became modern conservatism, built around coded language, of course. This work contains a number of flaws. Here's a few. For one thing, his story depends on the popular belief that the late 1940s originated suburbs. It depends on those unaware America rapidly built suburbs in the 20s, a trend paused for 2 decades by the Depression and the war. And white flight could be just ethnic succession, seen many times before, but presumed malign because the last black-skinned wave was visually distinct from those leaving. And what of the reverse? Around 1900, Polish immigrants moved into many Detroit neighborhoods and blacks moved out. Are blacks guilty of anti-Polish and anti-Catholic prejudice? For another thing, examining which whites fled the cities tells us why they fled cities. Most suburbs are racist hoaxers only tell the aggregate story. Blacks moved into city, whites moved out. The details tell a different story. An analysis of suburbs 1940 through 1970 in 70 northern and western metro areas shows, per Census Bureau maps, in 1940, the average white urban household lived 3 miles from a black enclave. For most urban whites, blacks were an abstraction. By 1970, areas adjacent to black enclaves became black, but distant areas stayed white. Only 1/3 of white neighborhoods in 1940s bordered black enclaves. True, these whites were over 1/3 of leavers, but the clear majority of leavers left all white neighborhoods, selling their homes to other whites. All told, white flight described was something of a thing, but not much of one. Yet for another thing, we see the same trends in the cities of the plains and mountain states with next to no black populations at the time. They grew suburbs at the same time as everyone else around cities like St. Paul, Minneapolis, Omaha, Lincoln, Denver, Boise, and Phoenix. All this and more can be found in Leah Bustan, The Culprits Behind White Flight, New York Times, May 15, 2017. Finally, they have the most insurmountable hurdle to the story. And that is the whole thing of the whole issue of black flight. So the fifth, where am I here? Okay, so yeah, the insurmountable hurdle to the story is black flight and what they declare they fled. Namely, they fled the hood and don't appreciate politicians subsidizing the hood to follow them. Quote, the harshest criticism of dispersing public housing tenants comes not from whites, but from blacks. In Harvey, a struggling working-class African-American suburb south of the city, nearly 1 in every 10 housing units is already occupied by renters with subsidies. Article Alex Kotlowitz, Where's Everyone Going? Chicago Tribune, March 10, 2002. Pushback by working and middle-class blacks, quote, in some cases has been fierce at public meetings, where black homeowners protested loudly that, quote, they didn't want those people moving into their rejuvenated neighborhood. Black homeowners at public meetings would, quote, would shout at officials that they'd worked hard to get where they were and they didn't want to live next door to people that would just tear up homes. They called them project people, low-lifers, and freeloaders, end quote. Another quote, some blacks feel that those people make it tough on those of us trying to make something of ourselves, to Shirley Newsom, a homeowner in Kenswood, Oakwood, and a longtime voice of moderation. That's why white America doesn't want me living next to them, because they look at me and assume I'm from a place like public housing, end quote. Again, from the Kotlowitz, Where's Everyone Going? Tribune article. Simplistic suburbs are racist narratives fail to capture the nuances of real life, and in any case, self-interest, not white solidarity, motivated the initial move to the suburbs. White suburbanization owes more to white incomes tripling 1939 to 1960 than to race, and if anyone can own a house in a nice area, why not? Symbolized personal success, later middle classes of color, move to suburbs as well, and to the extent anyone stays in the city, to that extent their race is middle class. What contextless Kevin Cruz calls white flight is a conspiracy theory. Now, black voters, I told you we'd get to that subject. Blacks became Democrat in the 1930s, not the 60s, the 30s. This means blacks voting Democrat is not about civil rights. This also means that black Republicans are not sellouts. Likewise, any other Democrat minorities, all cited as social proof of being the racial good guys, even though no minority group became Democrat as a result of the civil rights era. Blacks and Hispanics became Democrats in the 1930s and Asians in the 1990s, which means no group changed their votes because of civil rights. But does the New Deal alone explain black defection? Not really. The prepackaged narratives of W.E.B. Du Bois explain it. Before Du Bois, black voters were not big government liberals. This is why they didn't defect following previous economic downturns, such as the 1893 Depression, the 1907 Panic, the 1921 stock market crash and downturn. After Booker Washington died, Du Bois's prepackaged narratives that big government was the answer began to take hold in the black community. That dubious Du Bois was chummy with a number of newspaper editors to spread the prepackaged narratives never heard either. A key to this effort was the canard that Booker Washington, Du Bois's big rival when living, was a sellout. Yet Du Bois proved the real sellout, backing Woodrow Wilson in 1912, Wilson who segregated the federal government and caused a Klan revival. Plus, Booker Washington did more for civil rights than Du Bois ever did. From denouncing lynching and lobbying Congress to ban it, along with racial segregation, secretly funded lawsuits against Jim Crow measures from vote deprivation to the Bailey versus Alabama anti-peonage case. Meanwhile, Du Bois, as far as I can tell, achieved nothing for civil rights, all while endorsing Woodrow Wilson and several despots abroad. The shift in black partisan attitudes regarded the proper role of government, not civil rights, as more blacks abandoned capitalist Washington for socialist Du Bois, although more black political tendencies tend to favor just a generic more government rather than outright socialism. Indeed, before all this, Southern blacks built and ran their own businesses, becoming barbers, undertakers, restaurateurs, shopkeepers, etc. Quote from a book: according to the most conservative estimates, the living standard of the average Southern black, more than doubled between 1865 and 1890. But this only made Southern whites more angry and vindictive. End quote. It's from a textbook, Carnes and Garrity, the American something or other. Carnes and Garrity wrote a textbook. I'm sure you can figure it out. Let's see. It had a real long, boring academic name. In 1921, there was Black Wall Street. Yet by 1970, Nixon got called racist for advocating the very black capitalism that was once commonplace. Du Bois's handiwork had paid off. Du Bois needs a lot more scrutiny than he gets. This is a guy who was praising Stalin as late as 1953, who praised Hitler as, quote, absolutely necessary to get the state in order, end quote, and, quote, show Germany a way out, end quote, making it, quote, a content and prosperous whole, end quote. In 1937, he wrote, quote, there is today in some respects more democracy in Germany than there has been in years past, end quote. Du Bois deemed Nazi Jew hatred more rational than racism at home as, quote, a reasoned prejudice or economic fear, end quote. As late as 1955, he extolled Hitler, who, quote, built a magnificent system of roads and excellent public housing, controlled finance and wages, owned railroads, telegraphs, and telephones, end quote. Source of quote, Werner Sellers, W.B. Du Bois in Nazi Germany, Chronicle of Higher Education, November 12, 1999. Philip S. Foner, editor, W.B. Du Bois Speaks, a book from 88, pages 286 and 319. In short, while he spoke in favor of socialism and big government and civil rights at the same time, in practice he advocated big government at all times and civil rights when it suited him. Du Bois invented the narrative that capitalism was racist and used forced analogies to make it into a new version of slavery, unions and strikebreakers as analogs to resistant slaves dragging their feet. In his 1935 book, Black Reconstruction, in The Souls of Black Folk, back in 1903, Du Bois invented the narrative of blaming America and white people for slavery, calling America a guilty nation, and pretending there hadn't been a specific political party starting with D that did all that. So a whole lot of the Democrat operating system today, a whole lot of these canards are basically recycled Du Bois, minus the later quackery that came up with the magical switching parties conspiracy theory. Now to return to blacks becoming Democrats in the 30s, that also means a number of other narrative-busting things. Let's see. First, blacks were voting for the Jim Crow lynching party as it was Jim Crowing and lynching them. This means, frankly, it means black Democrats don't get to talk down to Republicans of whatever color. If you're going to vote for that, I mean, where's the moral authority to talk down to people who weren't doing that? I don't get it. Secondly, it means blacks were looking at Republicans who backed civil rights bills more strongly than the Democrats in 1957 and in 1960, and then voting for Democrats anyway. It means blacks, after Brown versus Board, still backed Democrats in 1956. It means all the crap about Goldwater this and Goldwater that isn't the real reason, but a face-saving excuse. After the Smith versus Allwright decision of 1944 invalidated the white primary, blacks entered the electorate, or tried to, as Democrats. Some Deep South areas dragged their feet in practice until the 65 Voting Rights Act, but the number of black Southerners casting ballots before 1965 was not zero. They got numerous officials elected, from Atlanta Mayor William B. Hartsfield, Congressman Helen Douglas Murray, Memphis Mayor Edmund Orgill, Nashville Mayor Ben West, Winston-Salem Mayor Marshall Corfees. So some success, enough registered to do something. Tended to be outer South and in cities. If insofar as it was a thing in the Deep South, it tended to be cities. In any case, yeah, so in closing, possession of the black vote, given how and when and why it came to be, doesn't confer any moral authority on the Democrats.